My name is Jennifer Schinke, and I'm an attorney with Inland County's Legal Services in Riverside, California, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel today. We have some great speakers who have some great experience with math error notices that will hopefully be able to answer some of your questions, their presentations, or later through our Q&A. We have Mary Gillum who is the director of the Low Income Taxpayer Clinic at Legal Aid Society of Middle Tennessee in the Cumberlands. We have with us Omeed Firouzi, who is a staff attorney at Philadelphia Legal Assistance Taxpayer Support Clinic. And we also have with us some IRS individuals. One is Cruz. He is an accounts technical advisor at the Taxpayer Advocate Services Internal Technical Advisor Program. He will be helping us to answer some questions from the IRS's point of view, as well as his supervisor, James Leith, who is not on at the moment, but may get on to assist him with answering some questions. So without further ado, Mary Gillum, did you want to go ahead and take on?
Thank you, Jennifer. Just a couple of session objectives. I plan to give a little bit of information about the IRS math error history and why how this arose. I'm going to outline some concerns regarding the content of the IRS math error notices and maybe some systemic issues involving the IRS compliance with the statutory directives as it relates to math error notices. May discuss a case study and a few possible strategies for dealing with IRS math error notices. And that will set the stage for Omeed, who will give us some information on how he's tried to combat some of these systemic issues he has seen with the math error notices and what works, maybe what doesn't work. And throughout this entire presentation, we're going to hear from Cruz regarding Taz's perspective and observations regarding how this issue with math error notices play out. And if we have some time, we may engage in some discussion with the audience about maybe some solutions that they've implemented that has been successful regarding dealing with the IRS math error notices and maybe the IRS failure to comply with some of the statutory directives. So just wanted to kind of outline for everybody what we hope to cover in this time we have today. But to go back and set the stage a little bit about math error notices, generally, if the IRS proposes a change to your tax return, that is the shortest and easiest way to define, not as the most complete way, but that defines a deficiency. So if the IRS proposes a change from what you reported on your tax return, then that is deemed a deficiency, and the IRS generally has to send out a statutory notice of deficiency. The authority for this is outlined in Internal Revenue Code section 6212. They have to send it by certified mail. The next thing is the IRS must send the statutory notice of deficiency and provide tax court appeal rights. For any of us that have ever litigated tax cases, we, for the most part, love the United States Tax Court, especially for our low-income clients, because that is the one place you can go to litigate a tax case, a tax controversy issue, and there is no prepayment requirement to get jurisdiction in that court. Generally, if you go to any of the other courts where you can litigate cases, such as the United States District Court or the Court of Federal Claims, and I know some cases can even be litigated in bankruptcy, there are filing fees for the court that cannot be permanently waived like they can in the tax court. But more importantly, at least with the District Court and the Court of Federal Claims, there is a definite prepayment requirement. And low-income taxpayer, if their IRS is proposing a deficiency of, say, $10,000, they can't pay that to get jurisdiction in the United States District Court or the Court of Federal Claims. So the tax court, being a court where there's no prepayment requirement to get jurisdiction, is very important to low-income taxpayers. And the requirement that the IRS must send out this notice of deficiency, giving taxpayers 90 days, in some cases throughout the country, 150 days, to file an appeal in the United States Tax Court without prepaying the proposed tax, if there's a tax liability, that is codified in Internal Revenue Code section 6213A. Now, when you look at that code section, you will see there's something that we're going to be focusing on today. The next subsection, or 6213B, is what is deemed the math error exception. And math error procedures give the IRS the authority to bypass the normal deficiency procedures in certain circumstances. The IRS likes it because it allows them to make faster adjustments and assessments. And it provides fewer opportunities for taxpayers to really contest those adjustments or assessments. These math error adjustments, whether resulting in an assessment of or reduction in maybe a claimed tax credit, they bring several significant consequences if the taxpayers really don't act quickly. So a little bit more detail. How do they impact taxpayers? If the taxpayer does not contest that math error notice that they're getting within a 60-day time period, the IRS can then just bypass the notice of deficiency. They can go straight and immediately assess the liability and move towards normal collection procedures if the assessment's not paid. Or they can keep, if the refund's at issue, they can keep the refund that's not been paid due to the math error adjustment. Taxpayer may be able to do some other administrative things to contest this, but they've lost their jurisdiction to go to the United States Tax Court. After the 60-day time period's expired, the taxpayer can no longer, like I said, challenge the adjustment in the United States Tax Court. Instead, they're left with maybe the option of challenging it in the United States District Court or the Court of Federal Claims. And if they have a balance due, as we said earlier, they must first pay and file a claim in those courts. Or first they have to file, they first pay, and they have to also exhaust a lot of times the administrative process before they can file a claim in the District Court or the Court of Federal Claims. So, some statistics. Millions of taxpayers have received math error notices adjusting their returns, including removing the recovery rebate credit or removing the claimed earned income credit or child tax credit. And I know the National Taxpayer Advocate, Aaron Collins, on April 7th, 2022, had issued I think a blog and report stating that the IRS had issued about 9.4 million math error notices as of April of 22. Of which 8.3 million of these are related to the recovery rebate credit and the child tax credit. So pretty significant utilization by the IRS of this exception to the notice of deficiency called math errors. The IRS's authority to summarily assess these taxes due as a result of the math error, it was actually first developed in Revenue Bill 1926. So it's really been around a lot longer than people realize. In Section 274F, it had provided the power for the IRS to look at certain returns and determine their math errors. The last major legislative overhaul was in the Tax Reform Act of 1976, which kind of expanded that to provide mathematical or clerical errors. And then it was moved to Section 6213, like we've been talking about. In 1976, the Joint Committee on Taxation noted that the service, not surprisingly, was using its summary assessment error, and they were using that power beyond what really was authorized by the statute to the detriment of taxpayers. The legislative history provided that the summary assessment procedures should only be used when it is not only is the error apparent from the face of the return, but the correct amount is determined with a high degree of probability from the information that appears on the return. So when it's clearly obvious that there is an error, and then the IRS can reasonably determine that from just the face of the return. But since 1976, Congress has expanded the definition of math error or clerical authority, and it encompasses many more situations than was the original 5 that was kind of laid out when math error was established, the math error exception. This has gone way beyond like I said, the traditional 5. So in Internal Revenue Code section 6213B1, it says in certain situations, the IRS can summarily assess a tax without providing the taxpayer with a notice of deficiency when they're addressing a mathematical or clerical error. B1 requires the IRS just basically to notify the taxpayer that it has or will exercise its math error authority, and that the tax will be made on the basis that would have been the correct amount of tax, but for the mathematical error. The notice is required when it's sent out. It has a 60-day reference, and the taxpayer is required to respond within 60 days from the math error notice. And when you respond within 60 days to the IRS, you can file a request for abatement. And the IRS is supposed to, under 6213B2, when you respond, to abate the tax. I know there's been a lot of discussion among advocates across the country. Do you have to submit this request for abatement in writing, or can you just orally make this request? For a while, I was under the understanding that you had to do it in writing. After a closer look at the statute, I do not believe you have to do it in writing. In fact, the IRS math error notices say you can call them, but I would never recommend doing that as the best practice. I would always, as the best practice, would recommend putting that request for abatement in response or appeal in writing when responded to that math error notice. You don't want to get into he said, she said with the IRS kind of as to whether you called and requested that abatement or not and asked to invoke your appeal rights. But a lot of people say, well, I didn't get a response. I filed a written request to this math error notice. I can also attest during the pandemic, I think I filed probably about 26 responses at least to math error notices. And for a period of 2 years, I don't think I got one response from the IRS saying we've abated this proposed assessment, or we're going to release this refund, or here's a notice of deficiency now so you can petition the court. I want to say that is a stark contrast to before the pandemic. I have done this for years, and we've had a clinic since 1999. And anytime we've received a math error notice, we have sent a response in writing within 60 days, and we have requested abatement. And if the IRS does not agree with our position, to issue to us a notice of deficiency. And we have with a few exceptions, we have pretty regularly received a response from the IRS either agreeing to abate or sending us a notice of deficiency. So the exception to the math error exception that we have invoked has been successful until, for the most part, until the pandemic happened. And I know there's a lot of reasons for that. But then it got me to thinking, I know what the statute says, but does the IRS policy manual have any guidance for these employees on what to do when a taxpayer requests an abatement? And guess what? They do. So the IRS has an Internal Revenue Manual policy provision. It's in 21.5.4. And it basically reads like this. If a taxpayer requests an abatement with or without substantiation, so you just might want to respond. Maybe your client hasn't given you the documentation to support why the change was wrong. That's okay. You don't have to have the substantiation when you respond. But the policy manual says when the taxpayer requests this with or without that substantiation, if they do it within 60 days, the service must. It's not to consider. It says must abate the assessment. So for abatement, and the IRM goes on further to say if the abatement request does not have any substantiation, if it's without substantiation, after abating the assessment, the IRS is supposed to treat the response as like an appeals protest and refer the case back to exams. If exams and the taxpayer disagree, then they're supposed to issue a notice of deficiency to the taxpayer with that opportunity to file a petition in the United States Tax Court. And the IRM, I think it's 21.5.4.4.1. It specifically does also address that question. The request can be written or oral. But again, best practices, always do it in writing. So what are the situations when the IRS can exercise its math error authority? The IRS may summarily assess 17 types of mathematical or clerical errors, which are codified in 6213 G2. When I first heard math error, I thought, oh, that means 2 + 2 is 5. Of course, if there's a mathematical error, I can see where Congress would carve out an exception for the IRS to say, oh, you made a mistake. 2 + 2 is 4. It's not 5. But it goes way beyond what I ever encompassed. Couple of the categories, just to give you an idea. Of course, the typical thing, errors in addition and subtraction. But going beyond, if you incorrectly use a table, maybe you're doing using a depreciation table to determine what the depreciation amount is that year, and you use the wrong table. If it's errors apparent and inconsistent with entries on the same return, that's a math error notice. I see a few of those with our low-income taxpayer clinics or clients who are self-employed. What I really see a lot of is taxpayers who use the incorrect taxpayer identification number, or TIN, or maybe their ITIN has expired. So there was a joint return and a spouse's ITIN has expired. And so the IRS is sending out a math error notice proposing to deny the married filing joint standard deduction or a dependent's tax credits, qualifying child deduction, but even though there's no actual deduction at the moment, but that's what qualifies them for the child tax credits. That's what I see a lot of the math error notices involving: I-10 expirations and denials of child tax credit. Credits or deductions that are in excess of the statutory limit or phase out, taxpayers claiming an earned income tax credit or child tax credit who had credits previously disallowed and they didn't recertify. I've seen a lot of these where a taxpayer actually did recertify, but the IRS has not logged completely the recertification in the computer. And so the next year they file the return, they request the credit that the IRS has reviewed and validated they were entitled to, but nobody has yet implemented that or noted that in the system. And so then the IRS issues a math error notice for them again the next year, which is really troubling to those taxpayers that feel like they're kind of going through, an audit or a substantiation process a second time. Taxpayers maybe who claim the earned income tax credit or the child tax credit where there's a ban under the statute, like the earned income tax credit statute, where there's a 2-year ban due to reckless or a 10-year ban if there's reckless and intentional disregard or fraud. So those 2 years for negligence and the 10-year ban, which was more significant, if those are in play, then they can use the math error notice, a math error exception as well. Now, 6213H1 and 6201A3, they treat excess claims for income tax withholding or estimated taxes that you list on your return, but they can't track that you actually paid. Those are subject to math error authority. I could kind of see that exception a little bit more. Advanced child tax credit and recovery rebate credits were also definitely adjusted through the math error authority. So those are kind of the main categories where you see the IRS invoking math error authority. And again, it's more than 2 + 2 is 5. The math error notice that's typically sent is in conjunction. It's typically sent out when they're processing the return, but it's not always. The service's view is that it reserves the right to make that math error or clerical error adjustment call as long as it's done before the expiration of the statute of limitations on assessment. So the IRS doesn't have to do that in conjunction with processing return, which I know is something that I wasn't clear on at one point. A lot of people say, well, what are the notice numbers? I can give you 3 main ones, but I have seen math error notices that are not the numbers I'm giving you. Typically, it's a CP11, a CP12, or a CP13. A CP11 is where they said there's a miscalculation. You owe money on your taxes as a result. The CP12, it says there's a mistake. You're now due a refund, but the refund amount has changed. I saw those a lot when reference to the recovery rebate credit or the child tax credit. Or then there's a CP13 where they said, we've changed your tax return and now your account, you don't owe us anything, but we don't owe you either. And the account balance is now 0. But I want to kind of definitely make clear it's not just those 3 notices. Those are the 3 I think that you see frequently. But I have received other notice numbers that are math error notices. The reason an item is disallowed or changed is often unclear from the IRS math error notice. So this is some problems with what you see when you're trying to determine. And the biggest problem of all, especially for new practitioners or practitioners who are new to this area, is it does not say on the letter you get from the IRS math error notice. You would think it would, because when the IRS sends out a notice of deficiency, it says notice of deficiency. So it says what the statute calls it. Math error notices do not say math error notice, even though that's what the statute refers to it as. So you have to figure out this is a math error notice. You can look at one of those 3 notice numbers I gave you, but that's still not all of them. So how do you figure it out? I personally look and see if they're proposing a change and they say that I have 60 days to respond. I'm taking the position for the most part that's a math error notice, because I know the 60 days is what's referenced in the math error notice exception of the statute under 6213B. The IRS notices imply that calling the IRS is the best option. Again, not recommended for a couple of different reasons. Getting through the IRS, one problem, but again, the verification that you actually made the call. But now some problems with processing of these math error responses. So you figured out, hey, they referenced in these 60 days. for us to request an abatement. So I'm going to treat this as a math error notice. I'm going to file my written response or oral response, but I'm going to respond and I'm going to contest this and I'm going to ask for the IRS to abate it. Well, if you're working these cases, it feels like that the taxpayer, when a taxpayer does this, the IRS doesn't have a defined procedure for this abatement. Well, they do, as we talked about earlier, but it's not really implemented very well. The IRS's failure to abate these assessments and issue notices of deficiencies really deprive taxpayers of the right to appeal and be heard, the right to pay only the correct amount of tax, and other articulated taxpayer rights in the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which is listed in IRC 7803. So that's something to think about if you're trying to challenge this in court. I really would look at the Taxpayer Bill of Rights under Internal Revenue Code section 7803 and see when you're filing your case in court, what rights that you can allege that have been violated in addition to 6213, the notice of deficiency and the math error exception statute. So this is a very significant issue. So what remedies are available, like with us, when we saw no response coming from the IRS during the pandemic? What can we do about that? Well, I would like to demand that the IRS give me my notice of deficiency. And when I couldn't get a hold of anybody in the IRS, the only way I could do that, bravo, was to contact the Taxpayer Advocate Service. So I would prepare and file a 911 form, and I would say, hey, Taz, I need your help. The IRS is not following the directives in 6213. I need you to intervene here and help me get my notice of deficiency. If the IRS is not going to abate this based upon what I sent in, or if I didn't send anything in and I'm working on it right now and I don't see I'm sending anything in the near future because it's going to take some time maybe to get a new I-10 issued, go ahead and get me my notice of deficiency. So I contacted Taz regarding that, and that has been helpful and not helpful. And I think that just depends too on the employees that you're working with. But generally, it is a helpful procedure. But we went through an educational process solely because I think with my local TAS office, like I think maybe a lot of local IRS TAS offices and other IRS offices, we had a large influx of new employees. A lot of people retired during the pandemic and we got new employees in. So those new employees, a lot of times, looking at what they could do to fix the problem, would jump in and they would always respond and agree to take the case and say, we're going to open a case to help you. So I didn't really have any problem with TAS saying this is not something we can help you with. They were really good about saying, we can help you with this. But when they tried to help us resolve the issue and we couldn't give them the documentation, like say for a new I-10, when the IRS is denied, like a married filing joint standard deduction and a lot of things that a dependence, maybe recovery rebate credit, or just something that the taxpayer qualified for. If we could not do that within a short time limit, then TAS was, some of the newer TAS employees were telling us there's nothing we can do. And I said, well, really what I want is the IRS to follow the statute. I want them to follow the directive. If we don't have substantiation and they don't agree with us, send me a notice of deficiency. And I know we encountered some challenges with that. I'm going to stop for just a second before I go on and then turn it over to Omeed. And I know, Bravo, I think you have some maybe observations and some things you want to clarify for the audience that TAS can do in response when we see this problem.
Don't mind jumping in at all. And thank you very much. And yes, you did clarify a lot of those things. And yes, the IRS as well as the Taxpayer Advocate Service, we're experiencing a lot of challenges with new employees, lack of funds, lack of technology. So there's a lot of things that we need ourselves in the TAS area as well as the IRS. I just wanted to let you know, yes, TAS is here to assist. TAS will take cases in. And for the most part, as you stated, we need documentation. And I know sometimes documentation is not necessarily available or any may not be appropriate. And yes, we will advocate with the IRS to make sure that the notice of deficiency gets issued, that the taxpayer gets their appeal rights with the tax court. That is part of our job. TAS, even though we are part of the IRS, we are independent from the IRS. So we don't ourselves, we cannot issue that notice, or we cannot make any adjustments onto the account. So technically, we are the middleman, and we're trying our best to get as much information, as much documents out to the IRS to get them to adjust those accounts. And I just wanted to say one more thing regarding math error notices. Technically, legally, there is no statute of limitations to appeal an IRS math error notice or math error appeal with the IRS. Technically, the law states that they can come back a month, more than 60 days from the issuance of the notice of deficiency, and provide the IRS the missing documents that they have, and the IRS will issue and adjust the account and grant the refund or the abatement that the taxpayers are requesting. So again, within the law, those 60 days are important, and the IRS stands by those. And yes, they are very quick about moving forward after those 60 days. But I just wanted to make sure that there is no limitation on the time when you can come back and appeal this, as long as the change or the appeal to the math error notice it was the same change that was requested on the original return.
So, Bravo, to make sure I clearly understand, like you said, the statute references 60 days. And I first heard you say that, yes, the IRS can go back at any time and kind of respond to this, even if it's after the 60 days that you're asking for the IRS to respond to it. Are you also saying that, and I thought I heard you say that it also means that you could still make the IRS issue a notice of deficiency even after, if you made the request after 60 days?
Yes, ma'am. The IRS has a legal obligation, and that's part of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, that if the IRS does not grant, let's say, for example, earned income tax credit, if they're not going to grant it because they're missing the correct TIN for one of the dependents, then the IRS has a legal obligation to issue a disallowance letter, which is going to be a 105, 106C, depending on the type of claim. It could be a full disallowance or a partial disallowance, 105C being a full disallowance. And yes, they will have to, and they're legally binded to issue a notice of, a disallowance letter. And we can ask for that letter ourselves.
Now, a disallowance letter, Omeed, you might want to comment on this, but a disallowance letter is a little bit different than a notice of deficiency.
That is correct.
Okay. And a disallowance letter usually invokes jurisdiction in district court, I thought. Omeed, do you have any insight on this? And not the tax court?
I do have some insight on this. So we had a case that we took to the U.S. tax court. Ultimately, that originated from a math error notice. There was no notice of disallowance in this case. But of course, Mary is correct that it's a different kind of situation, because of course the notice of disallowance is one that you can directly appeal to federal district court within 2 years of receiving it. But that's not something that I've seen yet associated with a math error notices in terms of the line of notices and timeline of getting a math error notice and resolving it through. But we did go to the U.S. tax court in a case that was highlighted in Procedurally Taxing last month by Keith Fogg. So this was a case that involved the Recovery Rebate Credits. So this had to do with the third round economic impact payment, the $1,400 payment that went out under President Biden in 2021. So what happened in this situation is something that has happened for so many clients of ours, which is that this is an individual who unfortunately was in a relationship that was abusive, and their spouse, they were estranged from their spouse, and they got a check, a paper check for $2,800 for themselves and their spouse based on a prior return for the economic impact payment for the advanced stimulus payment there when they were coming out in the spring of 21. And no one was ever able to cash that check because both people had to sign it. And of course, in this case, that was not going to happen. And other efforts to try and get money on her own part in terms of returning the check or doing something else to try and get access to it, failed. So in 2022, when it came time to file her 2021 tax return, my client reported the $1,400 of her own portion of this check as a recovery rebate credit on the return. She got a math error notice. It was a CP13 notice, I think. So that's referencing one of those codes that Mary mentioned, that it doesn't say it's a math error notice, but you know from your own experience that this is what that is. And of course, originally the IRS wasn't even putting on these notices for the stimulus payments that people missed, the 60 days timeline. They had to then go back and put the 60 days timeline on future letters because they acknowledged that they erroneously didn't do so in the beginning, something that the National Taxpayer Advocate wrote about in her blog. But in this case, they did put that language on there as they had been doing by now. And this was now happening in early 2022. So then in April 2022, we filed a response within 60 days of protesting this, asking for abatement, going by the language that Mary mentioned, that you must abate, especially in this case where we provided documentation. So it wasn't as if we didn't provide documentation to back up our case. We had even a PFA that she had against her ex here. We had a copy of the paper check that we could show. And so we provided a lot of documentation and sent it out from our own office, of course, via certified mail. And then in July 2022, we received a letter from the IRS in this case. It was a letter 96C, and that letter said that the IRS could not do anything about this, basically, because their view was that this was a civil matter that had to be resolved. So what they said specifically was that they reviewed the information we provided and determined that no action is necessary. Your issues must be handled through the civil court system, and the Internal Revenue Service can only provide a photocopy of the check, and they cannot determine who's entitled to which portion of the refund check. We treated this letter as a notice of deficiency because our view was that, as Mary mentioned, you have to go through the deficiency procedures through the math error process. That's what the statute outlines and describes, that, you know, this is something where there's a specifically statutorily prescribed exception where the math error kind of chain of command here, the next logical step is that the IRS has to send you a notice of deficiency and you respond to that, the petition of the tax court. Well, they didn't send us something that officially was called a notice of deficiency, but there is case law such as DEES, D-E-E-S v. Commissioner, and other cases, I think Auto Sales v. Commissioner as well, that say that it doesn't have to explicitly say that it's a notice of deficiency, as long as it actually bears out that there is a deficiency, which in this case, if there was, they had a decrease in refundable credit or an increase in tax, essentially, even if there wasn't actually any tax owed, that still could be considered a deficiency, was our view that we articulated. The IRS counsel disagreed. They filed for a motion to dismiss for lack of jurisdiction. Now, incidentally, we then responded to that with an objection to their motion to dismiss, and we described how, you know, why is a deficiency present here, even though there's no tax owed, because it's a reduction in refundable credit, and case law makes that clear that that counts. Why is this something that needs to go through deficiency procedures? Well, the statute bears out that that is something that needs to be followed in this case. And even if, in our view, was even if the court thinks that this is not a notice of deficiency, then there's essentially a premature assessment that's been laid out here, because they should have issued a notice of deficiency before moving forward here. And so we attested to all of this. And then frustratingly, in response to that, the IRS counsel actually did not respond with anything that quite directly disputed what we said. They instead laid out some factual things and other arguments that were not correct. They claimed that the math error notice, that we responded to it untimely when that was not the case. and we had proof of that. They also said that, well, it was received after 60 days. But the fact of the matter is that the case law makes clear that if you send it on the last day, that's okay. And if you have proof of certified mail, that's further ironclad proof that supersedes when they received it. So that was frustrating. Then in response to that, I called the practitioner priority service because I also wanted to get some official clarity on the date of the CP13 and everything, just to have this all, on the books. And somebody at the person I got at PPS, I said, by the way, like, just so you know, like this $1,400 here, this person never actually got it. And here's what's going on. And she said, oh, I see what you're saying. The check was returned as undeliverable. No one ever cashed it. We can see it in our system. So we're going to send out a $1,400 check to your client. And she got it a week later. So this is very frustrating on many levels, because if we had been able to call the IRS in 2022 and get them on the phone and get this resolved, we could have had this happen. The problem is, as you all know, it was very impossible, almost impossible. I don't want to exaggerate. It was difficult, though, to get the IRS on the phone in 2022. We tried in this case, and it was hit or miss. And also, even so, when they sent us that letter on 7/29/22 saying it's a civil court matter, they should have sent a letter instead saying, we see in our system that you actually didn't get the $1,400. The check was returned as undeliverable. We're abating it. Here you go. And by the way, they've done positive things akin to that in other math error cases. This week, I'm going to praise the IRS because I sent a math error for somebody for child tax credit that they denied because of a clerical error. It seems like on the taxpayer's part, I responded within 60 days. I said, here's the thing. And within 2 months, they just issued her the check. And I had somebody else who actually was in a similar domestic violence, estranged spouse situation with the stimulus. They got a math error. I called even and said, here's what's going on after she got math error. And they abated that and sent her the money. So it's not like they haven't done the right thing in other cases. So there is a framework to follow. And even if they sent that letter, they should have sent a notice of deficiency, even if they were going to object. But my view is they shouldn't have objected at all, because they could have seen in their own system that the check was never cashed. So she got the money. And then my hope was that this would be basically dismissed for mootness instead of dismissed for emotional lack of jurisdiction. But Judge Kerrigan ultimately dismissed it for lack of jurisdiction, just to put it on the point that the tax court's view in this case was that the letter that we got was not a notice of deficiency, basically, and that that's, even though the parties appear to have resolved the case, she said that they wanted to put in there that this case would have to be dismissed for lack of jurisdiction because we had failed to establish that any notice or determination sufficient to confer jurisdiction on this court had been issued here. So it was a very interesting and frustrating case. Mary?
No, this is fascinating and frustrating at the same time. So Omeed, the court then just says the response letter that, effectively we denied, it's the only response you got. You didn't get the notice of deficiency. They said that could not be construed as a notice of deficiency, and that deprived them of jurisdiction. Is that what they were saying?
Right, correct.
Okay, well, if that's the case, that's the court's position, and you've got a statute saying the IRS must do this, and they don't do this, then how do you invoke the tax court's jurisdiction?
Well, it's a good question. I think that, we made a good argument as to the fact that the statute clearly states this, and even if they think that this was not something that was a notice of deficiency, that the court should still compel the IRS to issue an official notice of deficiency. And my hope was that the court would treat this, in the end, in the way that they presented it as a mootness case, not as one for dismissing for lack of jurisdiction, because they should have gone about it as if that letter that we got was a true, like, unambiguous notice of deficiency. And what we what we said in our objection was just, looking first at the statute, of course, which makes it clear that when you have a math error notice, the IRS has to abide by the deficiency procedures. We described why this was a deficiency, which was something that was actually in dispute because the IRS counsel was not agreeing that what we had in our hands was actually a deficiency. So we had to even press that point. It was very frustrating because, when somebody gets this kind of notice, then the issue becomes, well, how do you actually address this then? I mean, if we hadn't called PPS, I wonder what would have happened. Perhaps we would have had to go through a refund trace. But then that becomes frustrating because, well, obviously it'd have to have been a written refund trace request, and the other spouse, they're not going to be able to get, you're not going to be able to get both spouses to sign it. Would they honor just one spouse signing a refund trace request? You would hope so. Why couldn't the IRS just do a trace on their own, frankly, in terms of seeing, why did they even need to issue a math error notice in the first place if they could see in their system that the check was returned as undeliverable and that no one ever cashed this check? So I'm sure that there will be other cases like this that come up in the future, because we have people who are getting math error notices for recovery rebate credits, for child tax credits that they're claiming, and so it's happening more and more, it seems like. And even in a 2022 case, Robinson v. Commissioner, they wrote that the secretary shall abate. That provision is mandatory. So that is another part of this as well.
Oh, thank you for taking that onto court. A lot of us were wanting to see how the court would treat the response that we got from the IRS that wasn't really titled a notice of deficiency, when the statute clearly says if you request abatement and they don't agree, then they have to issue that notice of deficiency. So that begs the question, and what you were trying to get to in this case is that if the IRS doesn't comply with the statute and issue a notice of deficiency, eventually, if they don't agree with you, then what can you do? How do you invoke the jurisdiction without this IRS notice of deficiency? And if the IRS, I'm not saying they're not playing fair, but if their procedures aren't working because maybe something like the pandemic is happening and they don't have enough employees to make sure that they're sending out these notices of deficiency, or what can you do? One of the things I was wondering is, can an action be brought to force the issuance of IRS notice of deficiency? And I don't think your court actually got to, because of the mootness issue in a way, but even though they didn't deem it mootness, they never got to really, was the question raised, and did they address, like, for example, even though they may feel they don't have jurisdiction because there's no notice of deficiency, can they make some directive to the IRS comply with the statute and issue a notice of deficiency, or would that,
That's what we were arguing, that they should be able to do that, and that they also, our view was that the court that if the court thought that there was no valid notice of deficiency here anyway, that the IRS here shouldn't assess a deficiency without first issuing a valid SNOD, and therefore there had been basically a premature assessment here. And also, of course, I should say, one option that was available to us after 6 months after she filed the return, or at least by October 15th of 2000, or October 18th of 2022, within 6 months of the due date of the 2021 return, we could have filed a refund suit in federal district court. But that can be frustrating because it's not as easy to file suit there as it is in the U.S. tax court, I would argue, because the filing fee waiver process is a little bit more cumbersome with the Informa Pauperis forms, and it basically, it's a whole thing, to say it informally, compared to the tax court. And so it's not as if there wouldn't be appeal rights, of course, and that may have been what we would have had to do in the end, and maybe we could have even appealed this tax court decision. But if it had been such that the person didn't get their money. But I think in this case, I was disappointed that IRS counsel here did not further entertain the arguments that we made in the objection that we filed in the case, because I think they were valid, legitimate, and compelling arguments, and we addressed it kind of piece by piece as well to try and get the court to invoke jurisdiction here by saying, principally that first of all, this was a deficiency. Second of all, that they were required to send us a notice of deficiency, and also that the letter that we had was a valid notice of deficiency. Even if you think it was invalid, the case should be dismissed for jurisdiction on the grounds that the IRS did not issue a required nod and that this assessment was invalid. And so therefore we said, well, why is this an assessment? Why is this a deficiency? Because it's a reduction in refundable credit. And we have other cases where people were actually getting assessments of $0 that still were considered deficiencies. Matinger v. Commissioner from 1993, assessments of zero taxes due were made in several years in 1980. So that's still an assessment that counts under the statute. We looked at cases involving, for example, premium tax credit, where people were denied that, and yet and that was considered a deficiency. And so, like, even if there's no actual tax due, if there's a negative amount of tax basically here, that still counts. In our view, there we even saw a case where you had, I believe it was a case where somebody's refund had been stolen or otherwise it was frozen in some way, and and so even though there wasn't any tax owed, the fact of the matter was that triggered tax court jurisdiction. We were arguing. One thing that people should be aware of in these cases is that you have to look at the two-step guide in the case Dees v. Commissioner, where they first review the notice objectively to determine if it's adequate to inform a reasonable taxpayer that the commissioner has determined a deficiency. And if that's satisfied and it's valid, you don't look beyond the notice. But if the notice is ambiguous, then the party seeking to establish jurisdiction bears the burden of proving the commissioner has determined a deficiency and that the taxpayer was not misled by the ambiguous notice. And so in that case, they held that even though the notice was ambiguous, the IRS had determined the deficiency by disallowing irrefundable credit. And that even this case, Pope v. Commissioner from 2020 cited to it. So there are a whole bunch of line of cases. I'm happy to send people our objection, and it was even in the procedurally taxing article that Keith wrote in early May. I know I've spent some time kind of being critical of the IRS, so I don't want to let Bravo go without responding to some of these things either.
Yeah, I was going to say we're getting down to the last little bit for our Q&A section, but Bravo, are there any other final comments you want to make from an IRS perspective or a tax perspective?
The only comments I can really make are going to be from the task perspective. And as I stated before, we are here to assist you, to assist any taxpayers that they may need assistance, even if it's an uphill battle, even if the odds are against anyone. Let us give it a try. Sometimes, especially with math error notices, I've seen from my own personal experience, they're simpler to resolve from the internal perspective, technically being with TAS, than calling the IRS yourself. Yes, a lot of those notices can be resolved by calling the IRS, but of course, I mean, lack of, again, we keep repeating the same thing, and we're all suffering through the same issues, that lack of funding, lack of staff prevents the IRS to answer every single call, to have trained individuals. A lot of retirements affected that. The experience and knowledge is not there anymore. But give us a call. Give the taxpayer advocate a call. Give us a chance. And I mean, all the services that we offer are free of charge. And the worst that we can say is, I'm sorry, but we cannot help you. But we can either get you a disallowance letter, get you your appeal rights, or I mean, that's pretty much it. I mean, we're here to assist. And again, we are independent from the IRS, even though we are part of the federal government. We identify and we operate and we take pride of being independent from the IRS.
So Bravo, can I ask you a question? Where I had 2 cases, for example, that we asked for help when we didn't get the notice of deficiency, and the advocates were really helpful in trying to help us provide substantiation to show that we were entitled to what was claimed. And I wasn't involved either. Some of the attorneys that were working the cases through our clinic. And then our attorneys just couldn't, within the time frame, get the documentation to substantiate. And they pushed back with the advocates, and the advocates said, well, if you can't substantiate, there's nothing else we can do. And I knew through the statute, they were just supposed to issue a notice of deficiency. So if a person runs across that with an advocate and who said, hey, I've tried to help you resolve it, you didn't substantiate it, there's nothing else I can do, which I knew there was something else that could be done, and I invoked that. But can you give some direction on what a person would do in that situation if they're running across an advocate, maybe not familiar with the right to or the taxpayer's right to the notice of deficiency? What should the person do?
Well, the person, they can always, I mean, of course, I would say the advice that they're getting from the case advocate from TAS is not necessarily a final answer. They are getting the information based on, of course, the knowledge that they have and everything else. The department that I work with within TAS is the technical advisor department, which we actually, they can seek our assistance. We provide a more in-depth perspective as to what else can be done. Unfortunately, those notice of deficiencies are, I mean, as you have experienced, are very hard to get. And technically, yes, technically speaking, a math error, it is a deficiency procedure per the IRS, but the IRS itself, gets more complicated than just a notice of deficiency. The deficiency procedures must be followed in order for the IRS to issue that notice of deficiency. And that's where it comes, those 60 days become very, very important. And as you stated, write to the IRS. Let the IRS know within those 60 days. Have a postmark situation that the taxpayer is disagreeing with the adjustment, with the deficiency that they followed. We can, as a taxpayer advocate service, we can use that as to the advantage, and we can make the IRS to follow deficiency procedures if we can prove to the IRS, hey, you receive this within 60 days. You have to do this. And again, we have the authority through the local taxpayer advocate, which is it's one in every state, legally has to be one. Through the national taxpayer advocate, we have the power to make the IRS follow the procedures. We don't take no for an answer as long as we can provide sufficient information. And we have done it in the past, and trust me, we enjoy in a way making the IRS do the right thing, because again, it's not easy to call the IRS and speak with 2, 3, or 4 or 5 different people, and you get different answers from everyone. As opposed to the taxpayer advocate, you only speaking to one person, and that single person can get you all the information that you need. So yes, there is more that can be done, and if they need technical assistance, invoke them. Have them talk to their manager, and their manager will. We can do more. I wish I could actually have a live case experience. That way I can let you know exactly what needs to happen. But yes, there is more that can be done other than, no, we cannot help you, and this is the end of the case.
Thank you, Bravo. That's what I really wanted you to clarify, because that's what I end up having my student do, is go through manager, and then ultimately to the LTA, the local taxpayer advocate, who said, oh, no, we can do more. And that's, that could issue, a directive out to get this notice of deficiency issued. So that was very, very helpful. And I know Jennifer is wanting to kind of open it up for questions. I just want to say one thing that we did not cover, in addition to what Omeed was doing in the tax court, and he mentioned the case Robinson versus Commissioner, which is a 2022 case. There's also a tax court summary opinion in Malone versus Commissioner. Both of these cases are a way to kind of deal with this issue if you don't get a notice of deficiency. If you let the case go on, which we don't want to, But if they let the case go on and we get a notice of intent to levy, final notice, or a notice of federal tax lien filing, you can always ask for a collection due process hearing, and you can raise this issue, this liability issue, because the taxpayer never received a notice of deficiency in time to petition the court. And then you can get jurisdiction if you don't get a good opinion. You can get jurisdiction for it to go back to the United States Tax Court. And both of these opinions that are really helpful, the one that Omeed referenced and the Malone, the one I just referenced as well, both of these opinions, the taxpayers got the tax abated. And the IRS had, it's really good language in these cases. The tax was completely reversed in both of these cases because the IRS did not follow the deficiency procedures. At the CDP hearing, the appeals officer didn't really deal with the liability issue, or they didn't determine, it was not really even a liability issue. It was part of the requirement in section 6330 that they verify the tax assessment was made properly, and it wasn't. So at that point, when the taxpayer appealed to the tax court, the court said, assessment wasn't properly made, deficiency procedures weren't followed, that they should have been followed under the math error. And so therefore there was an opinion from the court that tax assessment had to be abated. So look at those cases. If you can't get any resolution, like because of Omeed tried to do it early on, like you should, there's always that backdoor way through the CDP hearing and then review to appeal to tax court and review. And I just say with you, Omeed, we looked at going to district court. With the district court, the filing fees are not permanently waived like the tax court. You have to pay them at the conclusion of the action, and then you have to go through more hoops to get the court to kind of put it off to the conclusion of the action. So, and it's really hard with these rebate credit cases, or where there's the refunds are only $600, maybe a missing $600 recovery rebate credit, or $800 child tax credit, and then the filing fees in district court are $400. So that's kind of what really is hurtful. Even if you don't have to prepay something, those filing fees can really eat up the benefit you're supposed to get. So I'm sorry, Jennifer, I'll turn this back over to you. I know you want to open up for some questions.
No, you're good. You guys have all been giving such great information. I have been trying to let you guys talk a little bit, but we do have some questions from the audience, and I'm going to try to get to as many of them as possible. And of course, if you have any, you can put them in the Q&A. Audience, we do after submitting a request for abatement following the receipt of a math error notice, how long do you guys recommend waiting for a response before taking the issue to TAS?
I can take that. Technically, you don't have to wait. That is part of the taxpayer rights to invoke TAS involvement in any situation, any case. As I keep repeating, we are here to assist, and just bear with us. I mean, we are very short-staffed as well, and very overwhelmed with inventory. We're trying to get it to as many people as we can in a single day, but there's only so many hours that we can work with. But yes, there's technically no time frame to wait. If you want to respond to the IRS and automatically send a request to TAS, feel free to do so.
All right, and this question is for Mary. Have you been able to get TAS to get notice of deficiencies issued in your cases where IRS policy appears to be flouted in the EIP math error adjustments?
Within the context of EIP, I haven't had one that TAS has been able to get that notice of deficiency involving an EIP. But I have had one, and I even had a really nice advocate kind of apologize and say, look, I really was just trying to get the issue resolved, and this is what the IRS was pushing back and say they needed, and when you all didn't give it, I mean, I just didn't think there was anything else I could do, even though you were saying I could. I didn't really realize too how important it was to get the notice of deficiency, because it was more than an issue of getting the taxpayer's appeal. I mean, you're trying to protect the taxpayer, and the IRS is doing something that they are not doing that they should do. But I have with the child tax credit and with the ITINs, I have been able to get TAS to force the notice of deficiency issuance in those two cases, but not yet with the recovery rebate credit involving or the EIP.
Great. It looks like we are running on time, but maybe another question or two. Do you guys recommend writing or calling? And is there a harm in doing either one or both of them?
Well, I think Mary has mentioned writing. Putting it in writing is good with certified mail. I called in one case and it was good, but Mary, you would agree that writing is better?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Writing's better because if the IRS didn't make a note of it in their system that I called, and how am I going to? It's going to be my word against the IRS, and I want something in writing to back me up. I mean, the IRS, I've always said, talks in the language of documents anyway, and so there better be something independent to support what I have to say. But I think definitely best practice is to write. But you certainly can call. And I think I mentioned the IRM provision. It says you can call, and the notice, Matt, there notice says you can call. So you can call, but the writing doesn't have to be real extensive. Basically, in the writings I've sent in, I kind of repeat the statute that I'm asking for an abatement. I'm asking for, if they don't agree, an issuance of a notice of deficiency. My request sometimes, especially too, based on the volume of work that we do through our clinic, I've had them like just 2 or 3 sentences, and I just say what the statute requires. So don't let that be a deterrent to you thinking you got to do something pretty extensive. You don't. You really just have to make that request by repeating your rights under the statute.
Great. So I guess we'll do one more. I know we're kind of out of time at this point, but if a math error notice was issued and you do notice that there was an issue with the recovery rebate credit amount that was requested on the return, and you're amending it, do you still need to protest the math error notice if you're going to be amending the return?
And I would ask, like, okay, maybe I didn't understand the question completely, but if the IRS pushed back and said you weren't supposed to get this amount, but they released some of it.
Right. No, they didn't. It doesn't sound like it was released. It just says after reviewing the return, it's apparent that she wasn't entitled to the full amount requested on the original return. And so they're amending the return because there's a dependency issue, it looks like. And so they're amending the return. So do you recommend just amending, or would you protest the math error notice?
Okay, I can answer that real quickly. I never want to give up my opportunity for judicial review at the easiest point of entry. So I would want my notice of deficiency, and I would want to deal with it that way, even though I might amend the return at some point, even if, especially if I saw, I wasn't entitled to this amount, and IRS, but I was still entitled to this amount. I mean, you can always amend the return, but if you amend the return and the IRS does not agree with your amendment, they're going to send you a notice of disallowance. And you're going to have the right, like Bravo was mentioning earlier, you're going to have the right to administratively appeal that. And then IRS Appeals is going to issue a determination, and it might be that you're not entitled. Then you'll have 2 years from that determination to appeal to the district court. But I would much rather just go ahead. Like I said, there's so many reasons that even what we talked about today, but especially what Omeed was saying earlier with filing fees. I don't want to go to the district court. I'd rather go to the tax court. And the tax court's more familiar with these issues anyway. I know you have a right to jury trial in the district court, and that's one of the benefits going to tax court. But at the district court. But I'd rather get my notice of deficiency and go from there, because you're going to be out a long time if you take the other road.
Great. Well, there are a couple more questions, but we are out of time. So I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions, guys. But thank you so much, panel. I think you've been very informative and it's just been a great panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Stay safe out there, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.